This is the Situation Room. I read you. Go ahead. Give me all available information on President, over. All available information on President follows. He and Governor Connolly of Texas have been hit in the car in which they were riding. We do not know how serious the situation is. We have no information. Keep us advised on here. This plane on which Secretary of State, other cabinet ministers headed for Japan, turning around, but we'll read all information to decide whether some party should go directly to Dallas. Over. The Associated Press is coming out now with a bulletin to the effect that they believe the president was hit in the head.
This country was changed in all kinds of harmful ways, both domestically and internationally, by the loss of John F. Kennedy. And without inviting a lot of new questions, because I won't answer them, we're all going to learn more this year about why he was killed.
Can I touch on his death, sir?
Briefly, but it's the worst day of my life, so I don't like to talk about it too much.
Understood, sir. You wrote something quite ominous. I'll paraphrase. Basically, upon reflection, you find it hard to believe now that perhaps some of Kennedy's enemies were not behind the assassination. Have I got that correct?
Well, something like that, because I don't know. Nobody really knows, and I try to avoid reading most of these so-called conspiracy books. The fact is that Kennedy had enemies in the right wing, particularly because of civil rights and because his American University speech indicated that he was taking a more accommodating position toward the Soviet Union. He also had enemies among organized crime, as did his brother Bobby. He also supposedly had enemies among communists in both the Soviet Union and Cuba, though I don't think either one of them would have thought that they would gain by Kennedy's removal. All I meant to say in the book was, considering the number of enemies that he had in the military and intelligence circles in the United States, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him. They had opportunities to have access to arms, to reach out to the kinds of weird and confused individuals who can be recruited for that kind of work. I don't make any accusations because I don't believe in making accusations without proof.
Wayside, this is the Situation Room. I read from the AP Bulletin, Kennedy apparently shot in head. He fell face down in back seat of his car. Blood was on his head. Mrs. Kennedy cried, "Oh no," and tried to hold up his head. Connolly remained half-seated, slumped to the left. There was blood on his face and forehead. The president and the governor were rushed to Parkland Hospital.
It's still like yesterday to me. It doesn't seem 48 years ago.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street.
Do you want to take a minute?
And it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark.
The breakfast party awaits the arrival of Mrs. Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy's entrance draws another comment from the president.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting somewhat that same sensation as I travel around Texas. he wonders what Lyndon and I wear. But with
I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way towards the Trade Mart. It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Simmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by.
Brent, I was close enough to that car when it happened that I heard what she said and told them way back in '69. I said, she said, oh my God, he's been, and I couldn't tell if she said shot or hit. And the reason why I couldn't is because now I've seen the Zapruder film and I know that her face is down like this. She pulled him down, pushed him down, and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car. It was horrendous. She literally, according to Clint Hill, pieced his head back together on the way to Parkland Hospital and tried to hold his head together.
The presidential car coming up now. I can see Mrs. Kennedy's pink suit. There's a Secret Service man, spread eagle, over the top of the car.
I still have nightmares about it. When I got down to the plaza, there was such an electricity. Unless you were there, there's no way to explain it. But have you ever been in a situation where the hair stood up on the back of your neck? That's the way it was that day. The air was just full of excitement and static electricity. And I got my camera out to make sure it was working. I took pictures of the crowd, the buildings, just to make sure it was in working order, because I did not want to miss 1 second of my president. And you could tell as he got closer because the crowd got louder and louder. And he turned onto Houston Street, and the crowd just went crazy. And then they turned, and as soon as they started to turn onto Elm Street, left onto Elm Street, I started filming. And shortly after the car got all the way onto Elm Street, there was a noise that went bang, bang, bang. I thought that was those things that we used to have when we were children, that you threw on the sidewalk and they popped. You didn't have to light them or anything. And I remember thinking, why would somebody let their children bring something like that down to a place like this? And just no more got that thought out. And I'm filming the motorcade. No more than got that out of my mind when this big ba-boom. And when the ba-boom happened, it looked like the whole back of his head just blew off. It looked like a bucket of blood was thrown out the back of the car over the trunk. It was the most horrific thing I have ever seen in my life. There's no amount of movies, there's nothing that could ever portray what really happened down there that day and the awfulness of it.
Put me on, Phil, put me on. Phil, am I on? There has been a shooting. I repeat, a shooting in the motorcade in the downtown area.
The reason I was going downtown in Dallas that day was I had a lunch and day with a cute redhead that we made the date the day before. I just turned 27. I got stopped in traffic just as I was going under the triple underpass. I got out of the car to see what going on. I thought maybe it had been an auto accident or something, and I walked 4 or 5 steps to the front of the triple underpass where I could see what was going on. I saw this car come through the crowd with flags on the fenders, which reminded me that I had read about the president being in town. From where I stood, I could not see through the windshield because of the glare of the sun off the windshield. All I had was a frontal view of where I was. Well, I heard what I thought was a pop of a firecracker, and the thought went through the mind, what kind of idiot would be throwing firecrackers with the president going by. Then there was a delay of 3 seconds. and then the crack of two rifle shots, one right after the other.
Police say that 3 shots were heard. Both President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally were hit.
I did not realize they were shooting at the president. Being a very brave person, I ducked behind the protection of the cement there of the triple underpass after the third shot. I'm standing there wondering what had happened. A man in a suit comes running up to me. I later learned was Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walters, and he asked me, he said, "What happened?" I said, "I do not know." And together we walked across between Main and Commerce. We crossed Main and Elm to where a motorcycle policeman had stopped his motorcycle. And there's a man there sobbing. His head exploded. And the motorcycle policeman asked him who. And he said, "It's the president's." And that was the first that I knew what had happened.
The president was being driven through Dallas within the past hour in an open car when the shots were fired.
They always looked up at me, and he said, "Well, you got blood on your face." And I reached up, and there was a couple, 3 drops of blood. I was sprayed by concrete the right cheek. In the right cheek is where I was hit. Just broke the skin. It was nothing serious. I took my handkerchief, wiped it off, and that was the end of that.
Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
I heard a knock on the door of the conference room. Standing there was Dr. Charles Crenshaw, who was one of our senior surgery residents, and he said they'd just called the emergency room and said that President Kennedy had been shot during the midst of his motorcade downtown, and that they're rushing him right now to Parkland Hospital to our emergency room, and they want all of the faculty surgeons to come to the emergency room immediately.
The motorcade now approaching the entrance now to Parkland Hospital, traveling at a high rate of speed. Ready police cars converging on Parkland from every angle, from every point.
President's wife, Jackie Kennedy, was not hurt. She walked into the hospital, had her husband stretch her side.
With that, the elevator door came open, and there, sitting on a folding chair outside of Trauma Room 1, was Mrs. Kennedy in her bloody clothing.
And just now, we've received reports here at Parkland, the president was hit in the head. That's an unconfirmed report that the president was hit in the head.
I went into Trauma Room 1, and as I opened the door, the thing that struck me immediately was the terrible appearance of the president, who was lying underneath an operating room light on a gurney in Trauma Room 1 with his face toward the door and the light in his face. And his head was completely covered in blood. And he was attached to a respirator through an endotracheal tube that had been placed into his trachea immediately as he entered the emergency room. Right. And also to an electrocardiographic monitor. And so that's what I saw immediately. And I was horrified, of course, by that. But I was also simultaneously gratified in that I saw I was not by myself, that Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter, my 2 associates on the faculty, had arrived in Trauma Room 1 immediately before I did. And they had just placed a sterile surgical drape on the president's neck, where there was a small wound in the lower right-hand portion of his neck. And they had just begun making a transverse, a straight-across incision in his neck as I walked into the door. And as I walked by the gurney, on the left side of the gurney, Dr. Perry, who was starting to make the incision, dropped his scalpel and leaned over and picked up what's called an Army-Navy retractor off the surgical tray and handed it to me as I walked by. And he said, "Bob, would you go and stand at the head of the gurney and lean over the president's head and hold the retractor in this incision we're making so we can see," as he and Dr. Baxter were doing that exploration of that wound. And so that put me in a position immediately above the president's head, about probably 16 to 18 inches above the horrendous wound in the back of the head, that I could look down into and into the inside of his skull from where I stood. So that gave me the best and the worst view of the wound of anybody in Trauma Room 1.
Seconds after JFK's motorcade had bolted from Dealey Plaza towards Parkland Hospital in order to get the president as quickly as possible to the hospital, Dallas police officer Joe M. Smith raced behind the picket fence on the infamous grassy knoll. There he encountered a quote-unquote suspicious man lurking just behind the fence where many witnesses believe the fatal shots originated from. Now, Patrolman Smith, trained police officer, very important to remember that, trained police officer, pulled his sidearm from his holster and demanded to know what this suspicious man was doing. The man then took out a Secret Service badge, and he told Smith to keep looking, quote unquote. Interesting, right? Could be a Secret Service agent, whatever. Several other witnesses reported running into a Secret Service agent as well. The reason to focus on Smith is because he is a trained law enforcement officer. The same scenario played out moments later at the rear of the Texas School Book Depository. Remember, I just said that the official Warren report has Lee Harvey Oswald on the 6th floor Texas School Book Depository. So at the rear of this very same Texas School Book Depository, Dallas Police Department Sergeant D.V. Harkness also runs into several, as he describes them, well-dressed men. Police were sealing off the complete area at this point, and that included, of course, the rear of the suspected shooting location of the Texas School Book Depository. It didn't seem suspicious then when these quote-unquote well-dressed men simply told him they were Secret Service agents. Fair enough. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Okay, here's the problem with all the cases of these Secret Service agents spotted in Dealey Plaza in a nutshell. Are you ready? There were no Secret Service agents anywhere in Dealey Plaza. Let me repeat that for all the naysayers. There were no Secret Service agents anywhere in Dealey Plaza. I had interviewed NASA physicist G. Paul Chambers.
I had a chance to talk with G. Robert Blake, who headed the 7A committee, and he said he checked every federal agency. There was no federal agent of any kind on that grassy knoll. So someone was there with official credentials who no one wants to take responsibility for. Someone who shouldn't have been there. There was no federal agent of any kind on that grassy knoll.
This is the Situation Room. Over the TV, we have the information that the governor has been moved to the operating room. The president is still in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital. Do you read me so far? Over.
Considering the number of enemies that he had in the military and intelligence circles in the United States, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him. They had opportunities to have access to arms, to reach out to the kinds of weird and confused individuals who can be recruited for that kind of work.
Did Kennedy trust the CIA?
Not after the Bay of Pigs.
I know we brought McCone in.
Yes. Who was very conservative, but truthful, straight as an arrow, and very solid in preventing rogue agents running off with the family jewelry.
There was something very alarming in your book as well, sir, as I read it. The CIA, just prior to the launch of the Bay of Pigs, had done its own study of whether the plan would succeed or not, and they came to the conclusion that it wouldn't succeed. but they never told JFK that.
That's right. That was only long, long afterwards that we heard about that study.
What do you think they were trying to do? Were they trying to manipulate him somehow?
Who knows? The CIA was testing the new president, I suppose, wanted to prove to him how tough they were. Cuba was not a threat to the United States, but it was an irritant, and I suppose they wanted to show Kennedy they had an answer to this irritant. They weren't going to send American troops. They were just going to let Cuban exiles who wanted to reinvade and reconquer their own country, let them go ahead. It may have sounded good to them on paper, but it was foolish from the beginning to think that this little band of exiles could defeat Castro's army.
Many people speculate about the Bay of Pigs that they were trying to draw the United States into an all-out war against Cuba. Do you feel that?
I think the Cuban exiles were. Not so sure the CIA was, although the CIA was so confident of victory, they might have been. But yes, the Cuban exiles thought that they could go back and take over their government, take over the country, get back their land that Castro had taken from them, get back their business enterprises that Castro had taken from them, and they wanted Kennedy to be drawn into a war that the United States would win, forgetting that Cuba was backed by the other nuclear power, the Soviet Union, and it would have been crazy for Kennedy to start a war with the Soviet Union's ally, Cuba.
Your latest bulletin. President Kennedy has been given blood transfusions today at Parkland Hospital in an effort to save his life after he and Governor John Connally of Texas were shot in an assassination attempt.
You knew General LeMay?
I met him.
You met him.
He sat around the table when I was present, at least on one occasion. But contrary to the movie 13 Days,
yes, sir,
the Joint Chiefs did not attend our daily XCOM meetings. Only the chairman of the Joint Chiefs did, Maxwell Taylor, and he was a scholar. He was a reasonable man. He was not as hard-headed or hawkish or eager to go to war as LeMay and some of the others on the Joint Chiefs.
In the movie 13 Days, General LeMay is kind of portrayed as an excessive hawk, to put it mildly. Do you think that's pretty good characterization?
Yes, I do. General LeMay thought we could win a nuclear war. He thought, well, if we have a nuclear war, we'll probably kill 300 million Russians, and they'll only kill 100 million Americans, so we win. The other Joint Chiefs, remember, was the Chief of Naval Operations, who wanted to take Kennedy's restrained, passive blockade and have those destroyers, which were in the ring around Cuba, go out and look for Russian ships and shoot them and board them. And when McNamara said that's not the way to do it, Admiral Anderson is his name, complained and went to the White House and made his case to Kennedy that that's what should be done. And that's how ambassadors to Portugal are made.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place in the United States?
It was no joke when the Joint Chiefs, before that first week was over, demanded a session with Kennedy. When the Joint Chiefs met with Kennedy, Curtis LeMay, a man who believed in nuclear war, because he thought even if we suffered hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths, the Russians would suffer even more. So that was Curtis LeMay. That's what he thought was victory in war. He lectured Kennedy on what he thought the quarantine, the combination of diplomacy and the blockade, was too weak a response, and the American people wouldn't like it. Can you imagine a military chief lecturing the President of the United States on what the American people think?
I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this, and I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. In other words, you're in a pretty bad fix at the present time. You're in a pretty bad fix. I don't share your view that if we knock off Cuba, they're going to knock off Berlin. If we don't do anything to Cuba, then they're going to push on Berlin, and push real hard, because they got us on the run. If we take military action against Cuba,
what do you think their reprisal would be?
I don't think they're going to make any reprisal. If we tell them that the Berlin situation is just like it's always been, if they make a move, we're going to fight. So I see no other solution. This is almost as bad as the easement of Zuni. But I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
When Kennedy finally left that meeting and went out into the hall, he ran into me and he was upset, and he said to me, bear in mind, this is just the Friday the 19th. He said to me, he pointed to that room and said they're all getting things in worse shape, and he said to me, you and Bobby have got to get this finished soon. But turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room, and we have recorded for history, and what LeMay and the Marine Commandant, David Shoup, and some others had to say with Kennedy out of the room was pretty close to treasonous and blasting him. And I'm told that when Khrushchev finally pulled the missiles out of Cuba without the United States firing a shot, not only was Castro upset that he hadn't been consulted, but the Joint Chiefs were upset that they didn't have their chance for a war.
You pulled the rug right out from Jesus Christ. What the hell do you mean?
He finally got around to the word escalation. If somebody can keep him from doing the goddamn thing piecemeal, that's our problem. You go in and frig around with a missile, you're screwed. You go in and frig around with a little else, you're screwed.
That's right.
You're screwed. Some goddamn thing, some way, you can say either do the son of a bitch and do it right, and quit frigging around.
sir, when you submitted the letter?
I gave it to JFK, who approved it, and he and Secretary of State gave Bobby instructions to accompany delivery of the letter with 2 oral messages. Number 1, time is short. We're making this letter in a positive way, agreeing more or less with Khrushchev's letter, so this should end it, and we better end it fast, because you never know when the hawks will rise. President's in charge of government, but we don't want the hawks to take over and start bombing and invading by Tuesday. This is Saturday. The other message was, we can't, in a matter of a few days, persuade NATO to, which acts by unanimous consent. We can't get that by Tuesday to pull out the missiles in Turkey. But because the President of the United States had previously decided to take those missiles out of Turkey, we're not going to do it at the point of a gun, or nobody will have any confidence in us after that. Well, Mr. Khrushchev, if it makes him feel better, can be assured that it will be done in a matter of months if we can just get this crisis finished. So Bobby went to Dobrynin with the letter and with those 2 messages, and I woke up the next morning and turned on my radio, and Khrushchev was taking the missiles out.
I stood there while they completed that exploration of the wound that I pointed out here in the right side of the neck. Took about 12 minutes to complete that. And as they were completing that and saw that there was no damage to the internal jugular vein or the carotid artery, which is what they were looking for, and had put a tracheostomy tube in to replace the endotracheal tube, Dr. Clark, our neurosurgeon who had entered the room, had been standing by the electrocardiographic monitor, and he looked at it just as they were completing the exploration, and he said, "Mac, you can stop now," to Dr. Perry. "He's gone," because he had just flatlined on the electrocardiographic monitor.
Just a moment. We have a bulletin coming in. We now switch you directly to Parkland Hospital.
The President of the United States is dead. This is Situation Room, relay following to Wayside. We have report quoting Mr. Kilduff in Dallas that the President is dead, that he died about 35 minutes ago. Do you have that, over? The President is dead, is that correct? That is correct. That is correct.
He also had enemies among organized crime, as did his brother Bobby.
JFK and Bobby had gone after the mafia. They promised if they were elected, they would continue going after the mafia, and they did go after them. As it turns out, the FBI got Carlos Marcello's confession to JFK's assassination back in 1985, years before the Oliver Stone movie was conceived, let alone made. And the FBI hid Marcello's confession to the assassination, to controlling and working. Ruby was working for Marcello. David Ferry even brought Oswald to meet Marcello. All these incredible details. The FBI had that, much of that information on tape, all of it witnessed, and they've sat on it. Jack Van Lanningham was an ordinary person who kind of briefly fell on hard times, who was imprisoned with Carlos Marcello in 1985. Marcello admitted, yeah, I had the son of a bitch killed, and I would do it again. He was a thorn in my side. I wish I could have done it myself.
A major accomplishment of the Senate during the past year and a half has been the ferreting out of racketeers, hoodlums, and management-hired union busters who have infiltrated the union movement.
You borrowed the money in such and such a year and repaid the money in such and such a year. Now, when did your accountant make this study? When did he make it?
Yes.
just make it? The last few months?
That's right. Last few days.
Last few days he made this determination. And you can't tell us who he talked to besides you, Mr. Hoffa, and the other gentleman who was
Well, I think
involved.
you'll have to ask him, Senator.
Your accountant, I'm asking you. You're the one who made the report to the committee about what your accountant found, and now we find that there are no records.
Many people don't realize, and they forget, or they never knew, that JFK and Bobby made their reputations by going after the mafia in the 1950s. They went after the head of the Teamsters, Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa was very corrupt and took a lot of money from the Teamsters, essentially let the mafia use the Teamsters' huge pension fund as its piggy bank, and that financed a lot of the mafia building and casinos in Las Vegas.
Only Jimmy Hoffa can rejoice at his continued good luck. Honest union members and the general public can only regard it as a tragedy. Constructive labor legislation, however, for the reform of this general area will be brought again to the Congress next year. In the meantime, those who defeated this bill will bear a heavy responsibility for the racketeering that will continue to go on unchecked.
As soon as JFK became president, very short time afterwards, and his brother Bobby was appointed Attorney General, INS, needed to make up for what they had not done, the Immigration Service. And so, with Bobby's blessing, when Marcello went for his monthly meeting as a green card, alien, he was then arrested, taken, not dumped in the jungle, taken to the airport. Marcello lived in style in Guatemala. He had the fake birth certificate, but then the publicity in Guatemala became overwhelming, and so he had to be kicked out of Guatemala. So he was escorted to the border. The other countries didn't want to take him, and so Marcello did wind up trudging through the jungle in his $200 Gucci loafers with his only with his attorney, and if you can imagine, the most powerful godfather in America reduced to trudging through the jungle, fearing for his life, and swearing all the time eternal vengeance against the Kennedys that had done this to him. And that's what would bring us to Dallas later. The assassination wasn't a Dallas thing. They were going to kill JFK in Chicago 3 weeks before Dallas. Entire trip and motorcade canceled. They were going to kill him in Tampa, Florida 4 days before Dallas when JFK went ahead with the motorcade. Same plan, same people, different patsies each city. Chicago, Tampa, Dallas. But so, it wasn't like a Dallas thing, the assassination.
Senator Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline vote in his native town, Boston, Massachusetts. Photographers and reporters are all around them, for this is the man who in the next 24 hours may become President of the United States, and she First Lady of the land.
Any Democratic American candidate, whether it's JFK or Barack Obama, needs mafia help to carry Chicago is just pretty ludicrous. And more than that, historians have actually looked at the precinct level, including the precincts in question, and have just showed that, based on the votes for other candidates and that sort of thing in other races, that, there was no fixing of the vote in Chicago. Now, it was a very close election. Richard Nixon could have decisively won that election if Nixon had spoken out on the arrest of Martin Luther King Jr. In Georgia, where he had been arrested on some minor violation and was being sent to a prison in very rural South Georgia, which is a very racist part of the country. Black people at the time had a very tough time in Georgia prisons. In fact, the chain gang era had really not completely died at the time. You would still see the road crews working, and sometimes they would be chained and sometimes not. And prisoners would die all the time, especially if they were black or considered troublemakers, like King was. So there was a lot of thought that as the party of Lincoln, Nixon would speak out against this injustice. King's wife was certain King would be killed and silenced. JFK called Coretta Scott King, and then Bobby. He did have Bobby contact the judge. Extra legal, to be sure, but Bobby was not Attorney General then. This is during the campaign. And so, they took public action and private action to be sure that Martin Luther King wasn't sent to that South Georgia prison to be killed. There were several states that were by such close margins that if Nixon had only spoken out and had only gotten the same percentage of the black vote that he had gotten 4 years earlier in the 56 election that his ticket had gotten, he would have been decisively elected president.
The fact is that Kennedy had enemies in the right wing.
Joseph Miltier had inherited some money, a professional racist, a very sharp guy who liked to make money off of his racism. Apparently Miltier was involved potentially because since he had some money of his own, he could be trusted to carry money. Miltier was caught on Miami police undercover tape almost 2 weeks before JFK's murder.
Coming here, I think on the 18th or something like that, to make some kind of speech. Nobody got in here. It's more easy it is to get him. Well, how the hell do you figure the best way would be to get him? Coming off this building with a high margin rifle. You think he knows it's a long range? Sure he is. Sure he is. And they're going to really try to kill him in that place. Get this Kennedy, I'll tell you, it's going to be a hard proposition. The Secret Service, they never cover all the office buildings. That thing out there, take it up there in pieces. Son of it, take it up in pieces. All those guns coming out now, you can take them apart. They'll pick up somebody within an hour of that. They'll throw the public off.
The FBI got a copy of the tape before the assassination. I've talked to the FBI agent, Donald Adams, who was sent to investigate Miltier, and they didn't tell Donald Adams some things. Hoover apparently himself didn't want that tape given, so the FBI agent sent to investigate Miltier. He wasn't told about the Tampa threat. He wasn't told about the tape, and he doesn't try to interview Miltier because that would have tipped him off, but he actually kind of bumps into him on the street.
Well, how the hell do you figure the best way would be to get him? Coming off this building with a high margin rifle.
Of course, then when JFK is killed from a building with a high-powered rifle and someone is picked up within the hour, J. Edgar Hoover can never let it be known that he knew about that ahead of time and personally botched the investigation by withholding information from his own agent. So what you had shortly after JFK's murder, you had J. Edgar Hoover having to hide information about Joseph Miltier.
We got the information directly from Dave Powers when he was the head of the JFK Presidential Library in Boston. We arranged for Tom to have a private sit-down with him. Tom, went into the office and Powers pointed to a rocking chair, and Tom sat down in this nice rocking chair with a presidential emblem, and Dave Powers said, that's one of JFK's rocking chairs from the White House. But Tom was just stunned when Powers started telling him about seeing the shots from the knoll. Tom was also stunned when Powers said, he and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. And Powers said he did not know what that meant at the time, but it was made clear to him this was national security, it was for the good of the country, and it was really not until Tom sat down to talk with Dave Powers all those years later, I believe it was 1990, that Powers finally realized why it was for the good of the country and why to prevent World War III, just 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had to basically lie about what he saw. Now, again, if people should wonder, well, why should we really believe Lamar Waldron and Tom Hartman? On Powers and O'Donnell, we've got pretty good backup there. The head of our lower house of Congress in the 1980s was Tip O'Neill from Boston, most powerful congressman in America in the 1980s. And he was close to JFK, as were Powers and O'Donnell. And Powers and O'Donnell told that to Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill put it in his autobiography years ago that they saw the shots from the knoll and were told they had to change their story. You're starting to get reports that there was some sort of official Cuban, Castro-Cuban connection to JFK's murder. And you know that if that reaches the public or the conservative, hawkish members of Congress, they're going to call for an invasion of Cuba. You've got one ready, but hey, if you invade Cuba under these circumstances, you know, you're triggering World War III. And so if you're Lyndon Johnson, what do? What Lyndon Johnson did is, hey, we've got to cut off any real public or thorough investigation of the assassination, or it's going to lead to World War III. People should know, too, Lyndon Johnson did not want the Warren Commission. J. Edgar Hoover did not want the Warren Commission. Hoover and LBJ were friends. They wanted to do the investigation themselves. You know who wanted the Warren Commission? Bobby Kennedy's associates. They're the ones who wanted the Warren Commission.
Dick?
Yes?
I wanted you to know that I made that announcement. May I read it to you? The President announced that he is appointing a special commission to study and report upon all the facts and circumstances relating to the assassination of the late President John F. Kennedy. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is making complete investigation of the facts. The special commission will have before it all evidence uncovered by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're my man on that commission, and you're going to do it. I can't arrest you, and I'm not going to put the FBI on you, but you're goddamn sure going to serve, I'll tell you that.
It's really important for people to understand that there were several locations that shots were being fired from. I believe that there were shots from the back of the president. I believe that there were shots from the front. I believe that there were two locations from the front. One was the grassy knoll, and the other, the location that the fatal headshot came from, which is not the grassy knoll. I received over 3,600 real-time hours of specialized training in just the field of forensics, and was awarded the certification of senior crime scene analyst. I definitely could take the training that I had on working homicides, which was almost exclusively what I did, and translate that information to the Kennedy assassination. I think it was in maybe David Lipton's book that had a picture of frame 313 that has the blood spatter. I walked over and just looked at it and I said, oh, okay, that's back spatter. That's blood that goes from the entry wound, is projected back towards the direction the force was traveling from. In other words, it goes back towards the shooter. Like most people, when you think about the shots from the right and from the front, what's the front? Where's the front? The front is not the grassy knoll. So if you don't know where the front is, then you don't know where the shot came from. Normally when you do trajectory analysis to determine where the shot came from, you would start with the entry point, because you're at an autopsy, there's an x-ray, here's a hole, there's a hole, you line the two holes up, or the pathologist puts a dowel at autopsy through the head. They can measure that exact angle as it's traveling through the head, and that gives them a trajectory. The problem is we don't have a specific point. We don't have an autopsy with a little dowel measuring the angle of impact. What we have is a big area in the front and a big area in the back. I start out by drawing what would be an overhead of a skull if you were looking down on a head, and I just draw an oval. And you just take that oval and you divide it into 4 parts by drawing a cross and then the lengthwise of the head. And that gives you 4 quadrants. And so what I did is I made that entire front quadrant the entry, and in the entire rear quadrant, the exit. So imagine that it's coming in just to the side on the forehead as you're looking down, right here, okay, and that it's traveling back to come out right behind the ear. That would give you one trajectory line. Now, as you move from in front and then you moved across, every one of those locations is going to be another trajectory line until you finally are over here where it would just come in front of the ear and exit at midline in the back. What you've created is a large area called a trajectory cone, and the shooter is somewhere in that cone. The next step is that you would take the president as he's in the limousine. You would place him in the limousine. Now, in Dealey Plaza, they had Canning, who was a NASA scientist. The Warren Commission asked him to provide measurements on the location of President Kennedy's head, and he did so. There's another person that's done that. His name is Dale Myers, and Dale Myers has done this. Now, these 2 men are very close in their computations. So they measured how much is the head tilted down, how much is the head tilted to the side, and how much is the head turned from profile as reference to Zapruder. So if Zapruder is at a 90-degree angle, he is turned beyond the 90-degree angle a certain degree. Now, both of these men came up with 26 degrees. So if you take a compass, a protractor, you can put this down on a map of Dealey Plaza. You can measure that angle at 90 degrees plus another 26 degrees, and you have now indicated on your graphic the direction the president is facing. He's looking down and his body is tilted. He's over 26 degrees. If you were to straighten him up, he would be looking 26 degrees from profile to Zapruder. Now, 26 degrees beyond Zapruder makes him looking at the south corner of the triple overpass. That trajectory cone can then be placed within Dealey Plaza to determine where the shooter could be. Now, beyond that, you're going to have injury to the other quadrants of the head. So we know that we're restricted to that field, that angle, those trajectories. So you limit yourself mathematically to a certain range that the shooter can be within. And if you step outside of it, then you're going to have injury to another part of the head. So I did that, and the grassy knoll is not within that area. Not within that area. That eliminates the grassy knoll as being the originator for the fatal headshot. But here's why a shot from the front is going to create a back and to the left. It doesn't have to be straight on to push it that way. Have you ever played pool? Do you know anyone that plays snooker? All right. Ever hit a ball and made it angle into the pocket? Because when you have a round surface and you strike that round surface, it creates a momentum that is angular. And so it goes forward or with the force, but it also angles away from the direction that the force is traveling from. So if you've ever played pool, then you already know why it went back into the left, although the shot was coming almost directly straight on from the front. I think that we definitely have enough shots to show that there's a conspiracy and that there were probably at least 3 shooters in the plaza that day firing shots. This is just like going to trial. My job, when I'm at a trial and I'm on the witness stand as an expert, is to educate the jury, give them the information that I have, and let them come to a conclusion. I tell them my expert conclusion. They can disagree or they can agree. It is up to them. And if I want them to agree, then I need to give them a persuasive argument with a clear understanding of how I reached my decision. So that is all I can hope to do. It's okay if people disagree with me. I have no problem with that. I'm happy that anyone brings any kind of focus to this, because I think that the people that hear the contradictory information are going to want to find out for themselves. Why are these 2 experts not agreeing? And look into it a little more. Well, absolutely the magic bullet is ridiculous. I mean, bullets do not behave the way that they're saying that they want it to behave. And of course, the person saying that was a politician, had no forensic training, had absolutely no idea how bullets react, and hoped that the general public that also had no training would just accept that. Of course, we know that it didn't fly. And I think people are a lot smarter sometimes than politicians give them credit for. The Dallas Police Department did what they could. I think in some places they could have done better. I think that in some places they might not have adhered to their own written standards. I think when it was taken away from them and the FBI did it, the FBI had the mindset that Dallas PD did, and that was, we already have the person that's done it. The minimal work has to be done to prove this. There's not any question in anybody's mind. Everything looked like it was tied together. The Warren Commission had an answer, and they wanted validation, just like you said. They wanted things that would prove them right. And I think that's what they looked at, and that they didn't look at things that would cloud the issue for them. If Oswald had lived and there had been a trial, things may be a little different, because I do believe that at trial, whoever was running that trial would have wanted the loose ends tied up. And that would have meant more information would have come to the forefront. I think when he was killed, it changed the scope and the way they were looking at that particular investigation.
My husband had made friends and worked with a man who was retired as a military sniper. And he was at our home one evening and had no idea what my background was. As far as he was concerned, I was a housewife. So he started talking about his life as a sniper, because that was his life work. So I told him, what if I would want to shoot someone, but I want to blame it on somebody else? I don't want for them to be constantly looking for me. I want to make sure somebody else gets the blame for it. He said, well, if you're going to shoot them and you want to blame it on someone else, you're going to have to make some plans about when is the person accessible. And I said, I can do it outside, because I have a place where I know that they will be, and they'll be outside. So he said, well, You would probably need 3 people. Think of it as a triangle. You put one person at each point. One point would be you shooting the person. Then one point would be the person you want to blame. And then another point would be the distraction. Because when you are a sniper, there are 4 really important things that you have to remember. You have to do 1 shot, 1 kill. That's what he said. He said you need to know that you can do the job. You need to know that there's concealment or some way that you are not going to be noticed, that people are not going to see you. You have to be able to get away. And the way that you can do that is you have someone that creates a distraction. Everybody looks that way, and then you shoot, and they don't see you. In the midst of explaining all of this to me, he suddenly stops and looks at me and says, "You're talking about the Kennedy assassination, aren't you?"
Oh, man.
And suddenly he said that, and I was, "How did you know?" We talk. We talk. That's the only thing he said. Well, years later, I had an opportunity to speak with Craig Roberts. Craig Roberts wrote One Shot, One Kill, the book. He was also a sniper. So he came to me and says, "Would you like to go to Dealey Plaza with me?" So we go to Dealey Plaza. He walks on the other side. He walks around and he stops at this particular point. Craig Roberts stops at the exact same spot, turns and says, "If I were going to do it, this is where I would have been." It was just so nice to have him validate that same spot. Well, if it was the best place for him then, it was probably the best place for the shooter in 1963.
You were a sniper.
Right.
Could Oswald have done the shooting job he did?
You know, we get asked that, or I get asked that question a lot.
Sure.
Let's put it this way. I would not put myself, if I was by myself going to shoot anybody, I would not put myself in that position up 60, 70 feet up in the air, shooting at an angle. The hardest shot for a sniper or anybody or hunter is to shoot from high to low. There's too many variables. You know, the easiest shot would have been for the target is coming down Houston Street right towards where you would be positioned. That's where I would have taken the shot. Why did Oswald or whoever was in the building wait until the car was going away from you, a moving target inside a moving vehicle, 187 feet away? That's just, the superior shooters of today couldn't do that. I mean, I would never attempt something like that. But, I think that's the reason why there was no shots taken, because it would have given the position away. I think they waited, and whoever the other shooters were, they waited until they were in a position where they could all triangulate into one spot. I mean, that's a typical standard military operation, is you put people in front, people on the side, and people behind, so the target can't go anywhere. It can't stop, it can't back up, it can't go forward, and wherever it goes, it's going to run into the field of fire is going to be right in front of them.
Where would you have, if you were in charge of the shooting teams that day, where would you have placed them?
I would put a shooter low, flat trajectory somewhere in front, to the side of the target, behind the grassy knoll, by the fence. You've got concealment. You've got nobody can see you. I mean, you're behind a fence. I would certainly be in some type of disguise, like a police uniform or a suit, and have some type of identification. I would put another shooter in the Dow Tex building, which is adjacent to the Texas School Book Depository, on the second floor, perhaps. The target makes the turn and goes down Elm Street. You simply point the barrel of the rifle towards the lane of traffic and just wait for him to show up in your crosshairs, and you pull the trigger. I would put a shooter, and you've talked to Sherry Feaster, and I am in complete agreements where she puts the fatal headshot coming from the south knoll. That's a great spot. You've got great cover and concealment. And then the final place I would put somebody would be, if I had multiple people at my disposal, I would put somebody at the west end of the picket fence. Again, you've got 2 people in front, you got two people on the back and you've got one person on the right side. You can't put anybody on the left side. There's too far of a shot. But I'm going to put 6 people in there. I'm going to put 6 people, 1 or 2 with a spotter and a security officer. Probably the guy on the picket fence is going to have a security personnel with him so that he can, in case he's focusing in on the target, somebody doesn't walk up behind him. So I think you've got 6 or 7 people out there, and not everybody had to take a shot.
Would there have been a way to coordinate the shots so that they would all come in and around the same time?
Yes.
How would you do
absolutely.
that, Brian?
The first shot that's fired is your signal for everyone else to fire, and it sounds. A perfect example, a good analogy is I'm sure you've been to a military funeral of some kind where they have 7 shooters, 7 military officers firing a 21 gun salute. How many sounds do you hear? You hear 1, but you hear it 3 times. You hear 3 shots, 3 rounds fired by 7 men. It sounds like 1 shot. And I think the people that were involved in this shooting were highly trained military people who had done this before, and yeah, they were well. This wasn't thought up overnight. This was well planned out. These are professional hunters or military people. Just it didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision in this one event in the history of the world. And since 1964, nobody's ever been able to produce the same kind of results with the same rifle. That right there sells the whole case down the drain to me. The single bullet theory propagated by Arlen Specter is the most laughable thing since the Snow White and 7 Dwarfs story came out. Chief Curry, the Dallas police chief, he knew Oswald was in town. He was given information by the FBI agent in Dallas, James Hosty, who was eventually transferred to Kansas City, and said, we knew he was in town and we just didn't think he was capable of doing something like this. And they didn't transfer that information to the Secret Service. So there's a lot of culpability between the Dallas police and the Dallas sheriff and the FBI. Well, I don't know if you know it or not, but Bill Decker, the sheriff of Dallas, Texas, told his men the morning of the assassination that his men, anybody on the sheriff's department, was not to participate in any way, shape, or form with security. Well, it's standard procedure. For example, when Hillary Clinton came to Lawrence, Kansas in 1990 or whatever it was before they got in the White House, we supplemented our security with every law enforcement agency within a 40-mile radius. I mean, here's the President of the United States in a known hostile environment that they already had information that there was threats on his life, and driving right past the sheriff's department, and they're all out standing and waving the flag and not able to participate in any part of the security. I mean, you would have supplemented the entire security. We've interviewed Jim Lavelle many times, and he's a great old guy, but I asked him in front of 1,000 people one day at one of the assassination conferences in Dallas, and I said, we understand through the stories that you didn't keep records of anybody, and nobody kept records of Oswald's interrogation. And he said, point blank, he said, that's right, we didn't keep notes. What do you mean you didn't take any notes? Now, here's the most important prisoner you ever had in your entire career, and you didn't take notes of what he said? And Jim Lavelle looked at me dead straight in the eye and says, well, it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have changed the outcome of the case. We know what he said, because they didn't care what he said. They had their man, and that was it. And anybody else that throws up and says, hey, I'm a suspect in the Kennedy assassination, well, if you're not Oswald, you're not it. You didn't see Oswald do it. You didn't see anything. And that was their mentality. And that's the sad part, is that the investigation was flawed from the moment that Oswald got away. I think that's when the investigation just took a dive, and everything suffered as a result. I mean, they didn't care what everybody else said. If Oswald wasn't involved, then we don't want to know about it. I mean, there's countless stories in the Warren Commission testimony that support that. It's really sad.
The magic bullet theory is a totally absurd bit of nonsense. The bullet then entering his back, exiting from the front of his neck, and then turning in midair about 18, 20 inches going back from left to right to turn and strike Connally behind the right armpit, right posterior axillary area, as it is called in medical terms, moving downward through the right lung, piercing the right lung, destroying 4 inches of the right fifth rib, exiting from below nipple level, coming out, and then hooking back up and around to go into the back of Connally's distal forearm, the proximal portion of the wrist, exiting from the wrist after breaking the radius, a large bone and a 6'4" Texan like Kennedy,
Connally.
and then re-entering his left thigh, only to fall out quite fortuitously from that wound that had gone deep into the thigh, onto a stretcher, and then whose stretcher, below the stretcher, on the stretcher, I can't be sure. Daryl Tomlinson, I believe was his name. Donna, is that right? The maintenance man at the hospital, finding the corridors blocked, moved the stretchers, and lo and behold, there was the bullet. Nobody had seen it before. Connally was operated on, Connally was moved on a stretcher and so on, and there was the bullet. So the single bullet theory, which is the sine qua non of the Warren Commission report, and we Canadians and Americans speak the same language. Sine qua non means, baby, if you don't have that, you can't have something else. There's no ands, ifs, maybes, whatevers, moreovers, possibilities, rarities, or so on. You have a single bullet theory, and you can argue for one, the shooter. There's still a lot to show that it wasn't. But if you don't have the single bullet theory, then you don't have to go any further insofar as whether or not there were 2 shooters. But just getting back for a moment to the single bullet theory in Commission Exhibit 399, we've talked about its trajectory. Let's talk about its weight. In its pristine state, weighs 161 grains. As found, it weighed 158.6 grains. Do the math, 2.4 grains is exactly 1.5%. And yet we're told that that bullet, which left pieces of itself in Kennedy and Connally, all of those little fragments amounted to no more than 1.5% of the original weight. And then let's talk about its condition. That bullet broke 2 bones. And remember, Connally is not a female. We're talking about a 6'4" big bone Texan, destroying 4 inches of a rib and producing a comminuted fracture of the radius, one of the 2 bones from the elbow to the wrist. And by the way, the radius broadens as it comes down to meet the 8 little bones of the wrist. You know how you remember those? Never lower Chili's pants, mother might come home. That's the way you remember those. That radius broadens. You're talking about a big bone. So this bullet emerges pristine. And they did an experiment. Someone had the decency to say, hey, can a bullet do this? So they shot that same ammunition from a Mannlicher Carcano, and we'll get to that weapon next. Shot that ammunition into cotton wadding, striking nothing. Shot through a goat carcass, breaking a rib to simulate Connally's rib fracture. Shot through Kennedy's forearm to simulate Kennedy's radial fracture. And you should see that picture. The bullet at the far right is a bullet that broke a radius. The second bullet from the right is the bullet that broke a rib of a goat. And then the 2 bullets together toward the left a little bit went into cotton wadding. And then over at the far left, in its pristine grandeur, the hero of the Warren Commission report, Commission Exhibit 399, the magic bullet. The shot that really was the fatal shot came from the front, I believe, from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. That's the shot that entered in the right parietal temporal area and then moved backwards. And studies have been done. They've shown radiologically how the deposition of the fragments, the tiny fragments of the bullet, become more dense as that bullet then traversed and moved backward. And so you have that, and then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head. So I think that 3 shots struck the president. I called and spoke with Audrey Bell, who was the head nurse.
Right.
And she was very nice. And she told me that fragments of the bullet had been given by the operating surgeons to her to convey to the FBI. And she did that. And, you know, she didn't measure or weigh them, but, you know, there alone, you had fragments that certainly would have exceeded 1.5% of that bullet. Incredible. And while we're on the whole business of the gunshot, talk about the alleged murder weapon of Manic Carcano, considered by every long gun expert that I've ever spoken to. And there are a lot of them around here in our country, as you know. It's a joke. They can, you know, it's considered to be the most inferior weapon of his genre developed anywhere in the world. And nowhere is it a bigger joke than in Italy, the country where it was developed. It was called an instrument of love, not a weapon of war. You have these 18 surgeons working on Kennedy in the Parkland Hospital OR. And these are guys, you know, good old boys from Texas. They had no dog in the race, as Walter Matthau says in Oliver Stone's JFK movie. And they called it as they saw it, including the chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery, who described torn, lacerated, destroyed portions of the right cerebellum and fractures in that part of the skull. The cerebellum is located, put your hand behind the base of your skull on the right side, feel the bony prominence. If you could go in on a straight line, that's where you would encounter the cerebellum, okay? And yet in the autopsy by these two comedians, Humes and Boswell, we got to talk about them, the cerebellum is intact and the skull and the occipital region is intact, okay? Now, whom do you believe? You believe those Texas surgeons, or do you believe Humes and Boswell, two military pathologists and who are there with 4-star admirals and generals in the autopsy room and who had never done a single gunshot wound autopsy in their entire professional careers? Americans, everybody has to be told about this. That has to be pounded into their skulls. You believe the Warren Commission report, then you believe the single bullet theory. You believe in Humes and Boswell. You believe in the Manic Carcano. This is your burden, baby. You got to carry those big, heavy sacks on your back, okay? That's your burden. Unbelievable. I went in 1972 as the first non-government-related, non-government-sponsored forensic pathologist to examine the autopsy materials, and I pointed out something that other people knew, but no one had ever said anything about. Page 1 story, August 24, 1972, New York Times, look it up, President's brain missing, and it remains missing to this day. And of course, the brain had been fixed in formalin. They did go back 2 weeks later, which is the proper thing to do. They got to get the consistency to harden to that of a hard-boiled egg so you can slice it like you would a hard-boiled egg to make a salad. You can't examine it properly in the fresh state. It's like a thick viscous. It'll kind of flow a little bit from your hands, especially when it has been traumatized, as Kennedy's brain was. And they went back 2 weeks later, and you'll see, and look in the autopsy report, serial coronal sections side to side of the brain are not made in order to preserve the specimen. Preserve the specimen for Jackie Kennedy's mantelpiece, for his grandchildren, for whom? You're going to preserve the specimen for a museum? Unbelievable. And then the weight. Thank you, Brent, for bringing that up. Your brain as an adult male, mine, 1350, 1400, but the brain, which had lost significant portions, you know, brain splattered. So the brain in its fixed state weighed 1,500 grams. You have a 1,500 gram brain. When you have an intact brain that is swollen and edematous, somebody is living for a while and the brain swells, not getting enough oxygen, yes, it can reach that weight. But when you have a brain that is not fixed, was not edematous, and has lost portions of itself, 1,500, unbelievable.
We asked one of the Secret Service agents about that, why they had happened to come to Parkland, because we had not had any previous notification of that. And they said that generally when they went on a trip with the president, they would find out where along the motorcade route the nearest hospital was, particularly looking for a university hospital that was associated with a medical school if possible. That's why they had identified Parkland, which was associated with Southwestern Medical School. After he was pronounced dead by Dr. Clark, everybody in the room left, and there had been a number of people other than Dr. Perry, Dr. Baxter, and I who had accumulated in Trauma Room 1 during this procedure. And they all left immediately after the president was pronounced dead, except Dr. Baxter and I. As the crowd was leaving the room, they pushed the gurney with the president on it so that Dr. Baxter and I were pushed against the wall by the gurney and had to wait for everybody else to get out. And then after everybody had left, and just as we were about to then move around the head of the gurney and leave ourselves, the door to Trauma Room 1 came open and a priest came in, whom we later found out was Father Hubert, to administer the last rites. And we would have had to almost push him out of the way in order to leave the room. So we simply froze against the wall again and stood there. We felt it inappropriate, but we couldn't get out without knocking the priest down. So we didn't try to do that. And we had to stand there and listen to the last rites. And all I could hear Father Hubert say when he anointed the president's forehead, he uncovered his head, which was covered with a sheet at that time, and anointed his forehead and leaned over to him, and the only words I could hear him say was, "If thou livest," into the president's left ear. And then I couldn't hear anything else that he said after that. And after he completed that, immediately after, Mrs. Kennedy again came into the room and stood by the side of the gurney as Father Huber was putting all of his material that he had back into his little bag he had used to perform the last rites. And I couldn't hear what Mrs. Kennedy said because she spoke in such a low voice. But from the context of Father Huber's answer to her, she apparently asked him if he had received last rites. Father Huber said, "Yes, I have given him conditional absolution." And with that, Mrs. Kennedy grimaced. She didn't say anything, but she clearly was not pleased with having heard that sort of statement by Father Hubert. But she didn't say anything, and with that, she stood there for a moment silently and exchanged rings from her finger to his finger and back and forth between the two fingers. She stood there for a moment more, didn't say anything, and then walked to the end of the gurney where the president's right foot was protruding out from underneath the sheet that had covered him. She stood by his foot for a moment, then leaned over and kissed his foot, and then walked out of Trauma Room 1. And that was the last that Dr. Baxter and I saw of either President Kennedy or Mrs. Kennedy, because we promptly left the room at that time, too.
I have just talked to Father Oscar Hubert of the Holy Trinity Catholic Church. He and another priest tell me that the pair of men have just administered the last rites of the Catholic Church to President Kennedy.
When I entered the room, he had been cut out of his clothing by the nurses immediately. That's a standard practice for any injured patient, so that you can see the entire body and be certain that you see where all the injuries are. So that's standard practice to cut any patient who's been injured out of their clothes using bandage scissors. You just rip up the clothing and take them out. So he was unclothed when I saw him, as all trauma patients would be. When I entered the room, Dr. Baxter was on the president's left side, standing just above the wound in his neck, and Dr. Perry, who was the operating surgeon, was on the president's right side and had just placed this surgical drape on the president's neck, and they had begun the incision. So they were on each side of the president at that point. And Dr. Perry handed me a retractor and asked me to go stand at the head of the gurney immediately above the president's head and hold a retractor, lean over and hold a retractor in the upper edge of the wound that they were making to explore this injury in his neck. Put us all in a little group of 3 right around the president's head and upper body. Jenkins, our anesthesiology professor, was sitting on a stool right beside me at the head of the gurney, and I was standing up next to Dr. Jenkins, and he was working an anesthesia machine and squeezing the bag to breathe for the president. So that was moving his chest up and down. But he had excellent cardiac activity on the electrocardiographic monitor. So he was, as you said, he was alive, even though he had sustained an absolutely fatal brain injury. A train of other things down through the years that have led me to think that there was a shooter both from the 6th floor book depository, and whether it was Oswald or someone else, I think fired a bullet from that point that hit him in the back and then came out his neck. And then on the Zapruder film, as you see a good many seconds later, after he's already been hit, you can see on the film that when that first bullet hits him from behind and comes out his neck, that the president's arms and hands move up to his neck like that. And it's obvious that something has happened at that time. And then several seconds later, he disappears behind a sign along the edge of Elm Street on the Zapruder film. And 2 or 3 seconds after being behind that sign, he comes out from behind the sign, and a second or 2 later, Mrs. Kennedy at this point is leaning over to him. He still has his arms up to his neck, and she's concerned that something has obviously happened. And just as she is doing that, all of a sudden, the president's head literally explodes, and he's thrown violently backward and to the left. So that was clearly an absolutely different shot from a different position, somewhere probably around the hairline, although we didn't see anything there because his head was covered in blood, and we didn't see anything, but we saw this huge hole where I'm pointing in the back of his head that blew out probably a circular hole that was something like maybe 5 inches in diameter. Blew out most of the back part of his brain so that I could look down into the empty part of his skull there. There was nothing. I could look into the empty skull there. There was nothing there. And as I stood there, in fact, the right half of his cerebellum fell out through the wound onto the gurney in front of me there. And there was some argument later between me and Dr. Jenkins and other people involved as to whether this was cerebellum or cerebrum. That's a significant point, I think, because if it's cerebellum, it means that the wound in the back of the head was farther back than some people have said, who have indicated that maybe it was in the back of the head, but in sort of the front part of the back of the head, whereby it would be unlikely that cerebellum would come out. Well, the cerebrum was gone. That is the front part of the brain. But the cerebellum was the only thing that was left. And that's what I saw clearly to be cerebellum. Although Dr. Jenkins changed his initial testimony in which he said it was cerebrum, and later said, well, maybe I was mistaken. It probably was cerebrum rather than cerebellum. He had initially said cerebellum. Only one kind of a discrepancy. The pictures that we saw that were 8 by 10 color pictures of the autopsy photos showed a large wound in the back of the head. But in one of the photos, they were, what I thought, pulling a flap of scalp up over this wound in order to show a wound in the back of the head, which we had not seen any other wound except this large gaping wound. I was later told by someone that, well, this was not a flap of scalp being pulled up on the back of the head. This was just the way the back of the head looked. And I, said to whoever I was talking to, well, that's not the way it looked, because there was a huge hole where that, what I thought was a flap of scalp being pulled up over that hole. So that was the only sort of inconsistent statement in that regard. We, first of all, did not see the bullet wound in his back in Trauma Room 1. The next day, I was in the office with Dr. Perry. We had an office together at the medical school. About 10 o'clock Saturday morning, Dr. Perry got a call from Dr. Boswell, one of the pathologists at the Naval Medical Hospital, who had done the postmortem on President Kennedy. And he wanted to ask Dr. Perry some questions about the exploration wound in the neck. And then he also asked Dr. Perry, and I could see what was being said or hear what was being said, not by hearing Dr. Boswell, but by hearing Dr. Perry's response and answer to his question. But Dr. Boswell apparently asked Dr. Perry, did we know that there was a wound in the president's back? And I heard Dr. Perry reply that no, we didn't, because we didn't think it was appropriate to do any further examination of the president after he had been pronounced dead. So we didn't turn him over and look at his back. Well, there was a wound in his, and he said it was high in the back, sort of in the middle, but over toward the right. But he didn't specify exactly to us or to Dr. Perry where that bullet was exactly as far as the height of the bullet. I do know where this bullet was in the front of his neck from what Dr. Perry told me. It was right here. And then I do also know from the Zapruder film that the president put his hands up to this hole, and that was when the first bullet hit him, most likely from the back, from the picket, from the book depository window, or from one of the windows in one of the buildings around there. Just before I came into the room, and after Dr. Jenkins had seated himself there by the anesthesia machine, Mrs. Kennedy came in, she said, and Dr. Jenkins told me this right after we had finished what we were doing in Trauma Room 1, and he said she was holding a large portion of the president's brain, and again, it was cerebrum, and handed it to Dr. Jenkins, and just walked out after that, after she had handed that large portion of brain, the president, of the president to Dr. Jenkins. And I thought, well, I'll turn the television on and see what news is going on now. And as I turned the TV on, and before the picture began to form, I could hear voices. And the voices were saying, he's been shot, he's been shot. And I thought to myself, now what? And the picture formed, and I saw what everybody has seen many times, probably in various venues, the famous tableau of Ruby has just shot Oswald, and he's slumping to the ground. And so, having just seen that, I walked to the foot of the stairway in my house and called up to my wife. I said, I'm going to have to skip lunch because I've got to go to Parkland. They've just shot Oswald. She said, who is Oswald? And I said, he's the man they say shot President Kennedy. Got in my car and drove as rapidly as I could toward Parkland. And on my way there, I saw Dr. Shire's car coming toward me in the opposite direction from Parkland. And we stopped along the side of the road, and we both found out that we had both found out the same piece of information about Oswald, and he turned his car around, and we both then sped out to Parkland. We got there probably about, 30 minutes after Oswald had been shot. We stopped, parked our cars behind the emergency room, ran into the emergency room to Trauma Room 2, right across the hall from where the president had been treated, and looked inside, and that was a beehive of activity with all the residents and nurses in the emergency room working on Oswald, getting him transfused and ready for surgery. A fatal wound, but nevertheless it was potentially, and I underline potentially, salvageable. Unfortunately, what happened is that when he was walking toward Ruby, he saw him approaching with the pistol. And of course, there's also some evidence that he knew Mr. Ruby and that he recognized him. He saw him approaching with this gun, and as anybody would, he turned to try to avoid that. But that cost him his life, in essence, because when he turned, instead of the bullet going straight through from the front of his abdomen to the back, where it would have caused non-fatal bowel injuries, it instead coursed across, having come in sort of toward the upper left part of his abdomen. It went across the back part of his abdomen, the so-called retroperitoneum, and injured his vena cava and his aorta, the two main blood vessels in the body that carry blood to the upper and lower portions of the body, to and from the vein, vena cava, and the artery, the aorta. And that is really a fatal wound. In the great majority of cases, people bleed out on the site of the injury. But as luck would have it, the way the hematoma, that is the blood clot, formed around those injuries, he did not bleed out as they usually do. So we were able to open his abdomen, and Dr. Shires, who was doing that exploration, with Dr. Perry and I being the first and second assistants, was able to get clamps on those vessels after a period of probably 20 or 30 minutes from the time we got into his abdomen. We worked down through the clot and got the clamps on the vessel so that we could have controlled it. But at that time, he had had so much blood loss and so much injury to his heart muscle that he had a cardiac arrest at the moment. And Dr. Perry and I dropped out of the operation, and Dr. Perry opened his chest, and we took turns massaging Oswald's heart for probably about 30 minutes or so. And initially, it looked like maybe it was going to come back and begin beating again, but it stopped again, and then it got flabbier and flabbier until finally we gave up, and he was pronounced dead. The deputy sheriff, who was handcuffed to Oswald as he was being led out of the jail, and was standing beside him when he fell to the ground. And he told us as we came out after Oswald was pronounced dead, he was sitting out waiting to hear what was going on in the operating room. And so we came out and told him what had happened. And he then told us, he said, you know, when he was shot and slumped to the ground, I got down on all fours over his body and straddled him and put my face down in his. And I said, son, you're hurt real bad. Would you like to say anything to me now? And he said, Oswald opened his eyes very widely with that and looked up at him for long, several moments, like he was thinking about whether he was or was not going to say anything. And after those few moments, he said Oswald shook his head like that, real wide from side to side, like, no, he definitely did not want to say anything. And with that, he closed his eyes for the last time. Mr. Revel said, I will believe to my dying day that he was about to say something pertinent about everything to me at that time, but then he thought better of it and shook his head.
We have another report on the arrival of the body of the president. He's expected to arrive at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:05 p.m. That would put the president's body on a different plane than that carrying President Johnson, who has taken the oath of office, and Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. The three of them are in the forward compartment of the plane Air Force One, as we understand. So apparently two planes are being used, and the President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Kennedy will arrive in Washington ahead of the president's body. And as we have been told, the Pentagon, the military officials of the United States, have taken charge of funeral plans and mourning period for the president in the District of Columbia, and it has already been determined that the body will lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol, where so many prominent Americans have laid in the past.
I was dating a man who managed the Kodak store in Six Flags over Texas. He actually came down from Rochester, New York to manage the Kodak store at Six Flags. And he went back up to Rochester, New York in like September. I'm thinking it was September, first part of September. And he brought me an experimental camera back. It was a Yashica experimental camera. And it was a prototype. And he brought me 12 magazines. It was a magazine-loaded camera. He gave me 12 things of film. He said that should last me till the camera comes out in 2 years. He told me it'd be out in 2 years. And I had envelopes that I had to put these in and mail them to Rochester. You couldn't even get them sent off locally. You know, kids don't understand because all they understand is video nowadays. But we couldn't even drop it off like at the corner drugstore and pick it up the next week. I had to send it to Rochester, and that was my first cassette of film that I had used, so I hadn't sent anything off yet. It was a burlesque show, but all burlesque shows, like I didn't take my clothes off either. I tried it once, but the men started yelling, put it back on, so I figured that wasn't my calling in life. But it was a strip club. But back then, when you talk about strip clubs, they were burlesque shows, which is different than the strip clubs are today. You see more on the beach now than you saw on the stage back in the 60s. And they all had an act, and it was men brought their wives. It was entertainment. Well, I was working at the Colony Club, which was separated only by a parking lot from Jack Ruby's club, the Carousel Club. And I started working down there at a very young age, very underage. And of course, I lied about my age. But anyway, I would catch the bus from Garland, Texas, and ride it in by myself to downtown Dallas, work at the Colony Club, go back home on the 12:30 bus. And one night I was walking down Akron Street, which is no longer a street if you've been to Dallas recently. And the Baker Hotel drugstore opened up onto Akron. And this man stepped out of the door and the doorway and scared the mud out of me. And it was Jack Ruby, and he introduced himself to me. And of course, he could tell that I was too young to be out that time of night by myself. And from that day forward, Jack Ruby walked me to the bus station every Friday and Saturday night. He was a rough guy when it came to men, you know, in handling arguments amongst the customers between men. But I never, ever knew Jack to be disrespectful to a female. Not ever. I mean, he would be foolish. I've heard people say that he beat his women. That would be stupid. They got up at night and took their clothes off. Are you going to pay to see a bruised up, battered up woman on stage? Of course not. He didn't beat his women. A couple of 3 weeks prior to the assassination, I had gone over to the club. All three of the clubs that I mentioned before staggered our shows so that the clientele could make all three clubs. And the Carousel had the last show at night. And I was supposed to go to a club that night that was open late called the Alabama Club to a party with Jada. And I went over, which was the headline dancer for Jack. And I went over to tell her I had a migraine and I wasn't going to go. When I walked in the club, I saw Jada. There was a table at the end of the runway, and I saw Jada sitting at the end of the table. There was a chair, and then Jack Ruby, and then a dark-haired man. And I made my way up to the table, and when I got there, Jack stood up and pulled my chair out like he always did. And just as I was being seated, he very nonchalantly said, "Hey, Bev, this is my friend Lee Oswald. He's with the CIA," pointing to the man on the other side of him. Well, I didn't know, at 17, I didn't know what the CIA was. At 65, I'm still not sure what they are. I looked at this gentleman. He seemed dark. He didn't seem to have a personality. He wasn't dressed very well. He wasn't poorly dressed, but he wasn't dressed in a suit and a tie. He didn't look like he had any money, so I didn't have anything to say to him. I directed my conversation to Jada. And that wasn't the only time I saw him in the club, though. Just a couple of 3 nights after that. And when I say a couple of 3 nights, don't pin me down because I don't remember the exact night. I walked in just in time to hear this same man that I'd been introduced to stand up and call Wally Weston and son communist, but he used a word before that. And Wally said, "Excuse me, what did you say?" He said, "I think you're an effing communist." And Wally just laid the mic down, hopped off the runway, and walked over there and cold-cocked him right in the mouth. And Jack Ruby came and grabbed him by his neck, and he said, "I told you not to come back in this club again," and pushed him out the door. And I did not realize that Wally had ever told anybody about that until I did the Geraldo show many years ago, and he played that segment that when he had interviewed Wally, and Wally told him about hitting Lee Oswald in the mouth. Jack didn't want me to film the assassination at all. The biggest fight we ever got into was the night before, and I went to a party with Jack at the Cabana Hotel. It was, I think, Pepsi Cola.
That's right.
And we were just there for a little while, and he knew that I was going to Fort Worth that night, not the Cellar Club, but it was another private party that I went to. And he said, "Well, what are you wearing? You're going to see the president tomorrow night." But he didn't call him the president. I said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "What are you wearing?" And I said, "Well, Jack, I'm going to wear what I have on." He said, "You're not wearing that dress I gave you to see that." And we got, yeah, sort of. And so we got into it. And that's what I found so absurd about the news reports after he killed Lee Harvey Oswald, that he did it because he loved the Kennedys. Now, he did admire and respect Jackie Kennedy. He thought she was a lady of class, but he did not, his exact words, I can't say his exact words on television, but he hated JFK. He hated his brother Bobby, and he hated that so-and-so daddy of theirs even more. You have to understand, Dallas in 63, everybody was in the mob, you know, and we, the showgirls, I mean, we just thought it was the movies, or I did, let me rephrase that. I just thought these things happen in movies. It's just not real life, because we lived in our own little world that wasn't the real world. It was not the real world. And so I just never gave the mob a second thought. I mean, there was always men coming in both clubs, all three clubs, the Theater Lounge, the Colony Club, and the Carousel Club, with bulges in their, you know, their coats and pockets, and, you know, guns were always being thrown under the table when the Vice Squad came in. I walked in from the ladies' room, as I recall now, and into the middle of a conversation, and it was about the assassination. Now, I don't recall any specifics about the conversation, except that I made some statement like, "I was there when it happened, dude." And George McGann, my husband, who was later murdered himself in a gangland slaying, pulled me out of the chair and took me home and told me I would never, ever again bring up the subject of the assassination of President Kennedy, or he didn't call him president, he said of Kennedy, unless I didn't want to live to the next day to talk about it. The last threat that I received was in 1993, after I went on the Geraldo show and said that I was going to be writing my book. I was in the process of writing my book. And they were both postmarked from Houston. I still have them. And one of them said, I don't remember which came first, but one of them said, just had death in black boxed letters, death. And then the next one said, snitch, you're dead.
The shots apparently came from a grassy knoll, overlooking, apparently, the parade route. Probably from an automatic weapon.
I just drove to the police station and told them that I'd been sent there to make a statement. Detective Rose came in and started taking my statement. As we're sitting there, and about to the end of what I had to say, there was a little commotion at the door of homicide, and two policemen brought a guy in, a little bit disabled. Detective Gus Rose asked the two policemen, says, "Who's this?" He said, "Well, this is the man that killed that policeman in Oak Cliff."
From Dallas, that the police have arrested a young man in connection with the shooting. But so far, of course, there is no confirmation or evidence that he is the guilty party in the assassination attempt.
Later that evening, I was watching TV, I could see it was Lee Harvey Oswald is the one that brought in to the homicide and put in the office next to me. I remember Sunday morning, I knew there was a newsstand downtown, and I had my radio on and went down to get a paper. I wanted to see what the rest of the country was thinking about Dallas. So I wanted to get a New York paper and a LA paper. And as I was nearing downtown, I was listening to him transfer Oswald, and that's when Ruby shot him. I knew Jack Ruby. He was one of these guys that reacted to things on the top of a hat. Later, in talking to Jim Lovell, who was handcuffed to him at the time, verified my thoughts that Ruby thought he'd be a hero by killing Oswald. He thought that that's something that the whole world would think that he did the right thing and he was a hero. On the 15th of December, the FBI had interviewed me. That's 63. And this interview was forwarded by the FBI to the Warren Commission. Then on June the 5th of 1964, I read where the Warren Commission was folding the doors and sending people home. Their conclusion was going to be the first shot hit Kennedy, the second one Conway, and the third one Kennedy. I was talking to a man at work. He says, you know, we got a new cub reporter on the paper. He says, I'm going to call him and tell him about you, and he needs to talk to you. It is Jim Lehrer. Jim put the story on the wire services. The FBI was in Jim Lehrer's office at 4 that afternoon. J. Lee Rankin, who was chief counsel for the Warren Commission, Rankin asked J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI to go find where that bullet had hit the curb. And Hoover reported back 2 times to the Warren Commission, could not find it. But we have where he had sent a memo to the Dallas office on the 5th, that same day, to go get the pictures that were taken of the curb. So they knew, but he was denying it to the Warren Commission. So I testified on the 23rd. Buddy Walters testified, a couple others, and the pictures were there. Sure enough, it was a missed shot. Then the next day, the 24th, the FBI says, oh, we found where that bullet hit the curb. Matter of fact, they had to redo the Warren Commission after my testimony.
Senator Russell calling in on line 0.
Hello? Yes, sir. Well, you always leaving town. You must not like it up here.
No, that dang Warren Commission business has whooped me down, so we got through today. Well, I've just worn out fighting over that damn report. Well, they were trying to prove that the same bullet that hit Kennedy first was the one that hit Connally. Went through him and through his hand, his bone, and into his leg. And of course, if a fellow was accurate enough to hit Kennedy right in the neck on one shot and knock his head off the next one when he was leaning up against his wife's head, not even wound up. With that third shot, according to their theory, he not only missed the whole automobile, but he missed the street. Well, the man's a good enough shot to put 2 bullets right into Kennedy. He didn't miss that whole automobile. The commission believed that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit Connally. Well, I don't believe it.
I don't either.
The commission believed that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit Connally. Well, I don't believe it.
I don't either.
he contacted me about being part of the movie and if asked me to work with him on the movie. And we met at the Stoneleigh Hotel to have dinner. And he asked me if I had ever seen any of his movies. I don't do movies. And I said, no, I haven't. Have you ever seen any of mine?
Oh, my God. And so did Oliver Stone.
Yes, and that's how we met.
The reason I was going down to town in Dallas that day was I had a lunch and day with a cute redhead that we'd made the date the day before. Matter of fact, they had to redo the Warren Commission after my testimony.
Dr. Perry would never talk about it under any circumstances to me or anybody else. And I never really understood why that was. My own thoughts about it are that this is a pertinent point of history that should belong to the public. So that when somebody asks me about it, it's sort of my duty, if you will, to say what I know rather than to say, well, this is my private information, because it's certainly far from being that. It belongs to everybody.
JFK and Bobby had gone after the mafia. They promised if they were elected, they would continue going after the mafia, and they did go after them.
It's really important for people to understand that there were several locations that shots were being fired from.
For all intents and purposes, the motorcade security of the Dallas Police Department ended at the corner, at the intersection of Elm and Houston. That was it. There was no police except 2 officers standing on the triple overpass. And that's one of my, if you've read the book, you'll see the testimony of Foster. It was, you know, he was supposed to keep everybody off the railroad bridge over the top of the president in an open limousine. And he, when he testified, he said, well, I kept everybody off there except those 16 people. So he didn't do his job.
All they had to do was drop a brick on Kennedy.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, he would have been the first one of the guys I would have fired for not doing his duty.
They were so stupid in covering up, that so oblivious, so arrogant, so cocky. They didn't even know enough to make the brain weight a more reasonable measure. Unbelievable. Thank you for mentioning.
You're very welcome.
Something went out of America when John F. Kennedy was killed. And then to think that his brother would be killed 6 years later, that Dr. King would be killed that same year as his brother, even in a country 200+ million people, you can't take 3 unique leaders like that and go on in the same way, because leaders like that don't come around. I gave a speech during the Obama campaign quoting Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet, who said, once in a lifetime there's a surge of justice, and history and hope emerge, something like that. And I said, I'm old enough that twice in my lifetime, with Kennedy and Obama, we've seen that merger of hope and history, but it doesn't come very often. And I think this country, as I said in the big forum, this country was changed in all kinds of harmful ways, both domestically and internationally, by the loss of John F. Kennedy. And without inviting a lot of new questions, because I won't answer them, we're all going to learn more this year about why he was killed.
Is there any leaders now, do you feel,
that bring that to the forefront. Oh, that's a long hesitation, sir. I'll let it slide at that.